All right, welcome back to my show. I've just breached 2,000 subs, and a lot of you may not be used to the content that I made like a couple months ago, even. But most of the content that I make kind of borders the topic of Anglicanism. A lot of it is about Anglicanism, but also it's about history and society and culture. And I talked about that stuff more, and I have a lot of thoughts that I haven't tended to make a video about, and so I thought I'd get right back into it with my little PowerPoint format. Again, those of you who have been here since the beginning will remember my little PowerPoint format with my little Black Hills background. The topic I wanted to talk about today is this general Christian winter concept I've been thinking about a lot. What is the Christian winter? Well, I think what happened was uh, there was a general Christian society civilization in the West before World War One, okay, that dominated the world, and Christianity then became the default, and basically, uh, the questions in that society were mostly political, mostly strategic. There was and always is, by the way, the conflict between a genuine Christianity and a kind of cultural Christianity, which will definitely be a big theme of this video. Uh, but in a sense, there was this understanding of Christianity as a kind of mainstream concept. Okay, then World War One happens, the Christian order falls, and the ideologies that come to take its place are are different. And this is, I would say, the beginning of the Christian winter. This is like the Christian fall, the Christian autumn, if you will. And the replacements are really scary, and we don't like them, right? So we reject them as a globe. So the alternatives basically were, uh, basically I would say there was the conflict between liberalism, fascism, and communism, and liberalism was the only option that even tolerated Christianity anymore. Christian monarchy, which was the society that dominated before World War One, basically everyone was like, well, that didn't work. So what are the alternatives? And liberalism kind of wins out that conflict. Okay. Slowly, by the way, because of course there is the communist East for almost the majority of the 20th century. Okay. But I don't think it's a coincidence that after World War II is over, there's a resurgence, especially in the United States and in the Western world in general, of this kind of Christian conservatism. There's this cultural, I would say, kind of Christianity that starts to appeal again. Because we just saw all of this, the negative side effects of society abandoning Christianity. I've actually have a good example of this feeling. What I'll say is you got this sense from basically conservatives in the United States that it was like we're fighting Nazis and the Nazis hate the Bible. The Bible is important to us. Then you start to fight the communists. The communists hate the Bible. One of the important parts of American society is Christianity and our Christian roots. Something that I've always thought was interesting as well is, and we'll talk about this more later in the little slideshow, is um is the fact that America was a quote unquote freedom of religion country actually made America more religious than European countries that had a quote unquote established religion in a lot of ways. Why? Because Americans whose identity was fundamentally like libertarian, like I make the decisions in my life, even their religion began to reflect that. And so they were allowed to take their religion along with them as society changed and kind of, I guess, keep that influence in society. And today, we're probably one of the most religious societies in the Western world. Despite the decline of religion in the United States, we're still one of the more religious countries in the United States. And why is that? Okay. Basically, I think it's because we had a tactic for Christian winter that other societies didn't have. And my fear is there's kind of people who are going to reinstigate Christian winter within Christianity. And this will get into some of my more spicy takes about maybe even the trad movement. We'll talk about this in a second, and Christian nationalism. And I don't think I'm as critical of the movements in the same way as other people are. I'm definitely more sympathetic, but just some thoughts that will occur here. So what am I using the analogy of Christian winter, right? What is Christian winter? Well, if you read the Narnia books, there's this idea that there is this society dominated by the witch, and there's like this winter, and there's a dramatic scene where the winter starts to go away. And Christmas, right, it is in the Narnia story, it's symbolized literally by Santa Claus, is kind of the end of winter in a way, right? Why? Well, there's this idea that God is coming to dwell with us, Emmanuel, right? And so that ends this kind of winter, the symbolic deadness, the symbolic lack of life, the symbolic harshness, the symbolic dread. Okay, and I think we're going through something like that right now. I mean, people will talk about the meaning crisis, and the solution to the meaning crisis in our society has been Christianity. And you'll get people who are like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who are like dogmatic atheists. 10 years ago, you get people, lots of, I would say, dogmatic atheists. The people that were in the new atheist movement that weren't progressive are now kind of like, well, never mind. I'm done criticizing Christianity because the thing that happened when we got rid of Christianity was way worse. It's kind of the secular, even, consensus on this issue, and you get lots of people kind of coming back. This is basically, I would say, summarized by the Jordan Peterson movement. Why? Jordan Peterson was very good at appealing, I think, to, and I consider myself one of the type of people that went through this phase. I was an atheist in high school for all of the reasons of the new atheists. I followed all the new atheists. I watched Sargon of Akkad on YouTube as a teenager. Okay, why did that resonate with me? Well, it was this rationalistic worldview that I think appeals in part to people's egos. It appeals to this belief we have that we can understand everything. Does that make sense? If you're an atheist and you ask, where is the proof for X, and someone doesn't give it to you, you say, okay, well, the presupposition you have in your head is, I deserve an explanation. I haven't gotten one, and if I don't get one, I don't have to believe it. And I think atheism played into that. What Jordan Peterson did in a lot of ways was he said, hey, don't you think that haven't you thought about the human side of this? What do I mean by that? Well, Jordan Peterson, I think, reintroduced, in some sense, the idea of original sin, but also the idea that we make excuses for ourselves all the time not to do stuff. And when we make those excuses, what we're doing is we're not living up to our potential. I think this is where he starts to run into the accusations of Pelagianism. What do I mean? Jordan Peterson is very good at harping on original sin in a way and going through the Bible and talking about these things, but actually, coincidentally, right before I started recording this video, I think Gavin Ortland did a interview with Glenn Scrivener, who did a good talk about this, how Jordan Peterson kind of teaches Pelagianism and this idea that we can kind of take responsibility for your life and give it meaning by being a service to the people around you. And that is a good message. And a lot of people go through that message and end up in Christianity. But then you end up in Christianity and then you start to realize, wait a second, what about grace? Right? Grace is a central doctrine in Christianity. And I'm going to go on to this video to talk about how Jordan Peterson leads people into Catholicism or Orthodoxy. But even in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, grace is an enormous part of the religion, maybe less so than in the most dramatic, stark versions of grace theology in a Reformed person's perspective. But grace is an essential part of Christianity, and it's not really present in Jordan Peterson's version of kind of Western thought, if that makes sense. He basically talks about how it's up to us to take responsibility, clean your room, do all this stuff, and once you do all that stuff, you order your own life, the stuff around you will start to kind of fall into place. And sometimes it won't even. I mean, he talks about the book of Job. But regardless, he goes through the Christian story. Okay? Keep myself on track here. He goes through the Christian story and gives a version of the Christian story that solves not necessarily the meta problem, but solves the problem we were having in the meaning crisis. Because the meaning crisis was we came out of this period of defining America by liberalism, in a way, a conflict between conservative Western identity and I make all of the meaning of my own world, right? I'm the existential meaning creator, and it's a duty and it's an obligation. The conflict with nihilism in Western society. We came out of that, and the question we were asking wasn't grace related, if that makes sense. People don't believe in this kind of mystical grace world where God does stuff for humanity. And so they're not receptive to the grace conversation. This would be maybe my criticism of people criticizing Jordan Peterson for being a Pelagian, is in one sense, the gospel is good news that speaks to the ills of our society, to every ill. That's going to be a theme of this. right? So Christianity is the meta solution to all problems. It's the meta fact, and it's not just the solution to one problem. So when you overemphasize one element of Christianity over another, you end up turning it into a solution to one problem, and not a solution to all of your problems. And while that problem is the biggest problem, it remains the correct solution. It makes Christianity appealing, and it works, basically. But once that problem goes away, and it might not go away for generations, but once that problem goes away, you're going to have to adapt to the new problem, and you're going to have to address the new problem. And if you didn't kind of, I guess, keep all of the answers neatly available, it's going to kind of fall apart, or at least that version of Christianity will, and it will be replaced by a new version of Christianity that is a solution to that new problem that society is looking to Christianity for, instead of a kind of proper sedentary Christianity that is unchanging, that can kind of really combat all of these problems because we've got all of the equipment. Now, this is probably when like the Orthodox or the Catholic viewer of my channel is going, yes, yeah, baby, that's us, that's Rome, baby, that's Constantinople, that's Moscow, baby. And here's what I'm gonna kind of say: I don't think that's the full picture. What do I mean? I think to some extent, actually, that this answering of certain problems has taken privilege in those systems too. So I think Rome, the papacy, all of these organizational structures that had a key role in running Western civilization throughout history, have had to answer Western civilization problems, and have had to answer humanity problems. So, in my humble opinion, I think things like purgatory were easy tools for answering questions on a societal level of why should I be obedient, right? What do I mean? Okay, so people will point out, if you read Paul's epistles, he's teaching grace, and he gets accused of antinomianism. And his answer to antinomianism isn't, I think if you were a Roman Catholic and you were like, what's the answer to antinomianism? You would just start talking about purgatory. Okay? But Paul doesn't bring up purgatory. Paul makes a more slow, careful argument about love for God and that love and all these things. Anyway, I would say the Pauline response to antinomianism is more about how love naturally produces good works. You do them out of love for God, and you do them because Jesus told us to go and sin no more, and that you don't want, grace is good because it forgives sins, but that we shouldn't sin so that grace may abound. It's basically Paul's response. Okay, but I think on a societal level, that nuanced explanation, that spirit-filled thing, it doesn't work in a cultural Christianity setting. Why? Because cultural Christianity is this kind of surface-level Christianity that doesn't break into your heart, and you don't get the virtue of Christian love and Christian charity. Again, even in the Roman Catholic system, if you read Thomas Aquinas, he talks about this. There are lots of people who probably think they're saved and they're probably not. Okay? In fact, actually, Trent is pretty explicit in condemning people for thinking, for using this kind of certainty of I'm going to be saved language, and they shouldn't have a kind of Cartesian certainty. It might be the apologist's version of it, but you shouldn't have assurance of salvation. You should be struggling. Okay? And so if lots of people aren't going to actually, go the full mile of salvation, how do we run a society on these principles? Basically, I think things like purgatory are a solution to that. Now, we can talk about whether or not they're true, but they're an answer to that problem until they become the problem, right? So purgatory is the answer to a problem until the Protestant Reformation, because then the Protestant Reformation starts saying, hey, I'm not finding this in Scripture, and there's people's consciences are totally burdened. Martin Luther is a great example of this. Let me stop here, actually. Okay, Martin Luther is a great example of this. He's basically saying his conscience is so burdened by all of his sins. He's making sure he's atoned for each and every one of them. He sits in the confessional for hours with Staupitz, right? Okay. And so his problem, I think, is the fact that the Protestant Reformation explodes across Europe shows that his problem was shared by many Christians who were looking for an answer to that problem. Does that make sense? So much so that I would say you start to get a kind of morphable Christianity because we start to use Christianity as a problem solver. This is where the Protestants are going to start to be like, no, no. And wait, don't worry. I'll still talk about why I'm a Protestant at the end of this, but you get this way of looking at Christianity as a problem solver, okay? And so you say, here's the problem, how does Christianity solve the problem? And then when you get an answer to the how did it solve the problem, that becomes what Christianity is, but that's not really true, okay? And so the same thing is happening now. The same thing is happening with the meaning crisis. People are saying, the meaning crisis is, what is your place in society? Why should I be responsible? Why should I do, all these things? What should I motivate all of my actions towards? And ritual and the kind of high ornamentology, if I can use that word, is the exact opposite, basically, to the therapeutic deism that we're all used to. Okay, growing up in society, and the boring, the ugly world we live in. I don't blame people for finding the exact opposite of our society and going there. But that's basically what the Anabaptists and the Protestant Reformation did, right? So they just kind of threw away all of the social order of civilization and said, whatever is the opposite of this thing that's really plaguing my life, I'm going to go there, okay? And I think that's a little bit happening with the meaning crisis. Now, when I compared Jordan Peterson to a Pelagian a little bit, and then I said, oh, the people that like Jordan Peterson are going into Catholicism or Orthodoxy, I don't think that's because they stay Pelagians, but they started as Pelagians. And it's actually less of a leap, I think, hopefully, that's not too offensive. It's less of a leap from Pelagianism to the systems of salvation in Catholicism and Orthodoxy than it is into Protestantism, and especially into the evangelical decision theology salvation of you just kind of make a decision for Christ and then you're good, which a lot of people grew up with, which I think was the product of this exact problem, which was people saw what was in their society and they wanted to mimic it. What do I mean? Okay. So I think Puritans are a good example of what was of this process, right? So Puritans thought that there were all these problems with Catholicism, okay? And Protestants agreed. And so, England becomes a Protestant country. And in England, the establishment says, you're right, Catholicism is wrong. And the Puritan appeal is, okay, you can agree that Catholicism is wrong about XYZ, okay? Then you must admit that the papists were wrong about every single thing. And we have to get rid of everything that looks papist. We have to go the complete other direction, okay? And that overcorrection wasn't available temptation at that time, okay? But today, look at the Puritan churches in the United States. You're like, wait, the Puritan churches? What are you talking about? Well, the Puritan churches technically are a part of what's called the United Churches of Christ, if you follow them genealogically. Of course, there were more splinter groups that tried to stay faithful. But there is not a huge congregationalist, is what they would be called, church today in the United States, okay? Despite the fact that the Congregationalists ran like half the country, okay, at the time of the Revolution and for a long time after, okay? And that's because their system was set up in one context to answer one question, and it doesn't last, okay? Then you have the American Revolution, okay? And the American Revolution emphasizes what? Enlightenment values and things like individual liberty and peace and personal conscience, all of these kinds of freedoms. And I'm going to upset everybody in this video. I'm about to upset some Credo Baptists. That's where Credo Baptism starts to become really popular in the United States. So 70% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans, I think, about. Okay. And there's like no Baptists in the United States. Then the Protestant Reformation happens. I mean, the American Revolution happens, and suddenly they start to gain some traction. And the evangelical denominations in the United States, like Methodists and Baptists, start to, explode. And then you get the Disciples of Christ and what's called the Churches of Christ, the Restorationists, all starting to be Credo Baptists. And people at the time basically build these denominations as acceptable American denominations. What am I talking about? This might be offensive to people who think this is the truly revealed part of the Bible, but here's my overture, okay? There were very, very, very low church Protestants in the Reformation, like the Puritans, like the Zwinglians, like that really wanted to just go by the Bible, ground up regulative principle of worship, and get rid of everything they possibly could that looked vaguely Roman Catholic. Okay, and they were adamant about this. They were radical about this, and they didn't get rid of infant baptism. Okay, the Puritans had infant baptism. The Methodists had infant baptism. That was not the thing they were gunning for. But as soon as we start to think about this kind of individualistic worldview, as soon as we start to say like, oh, actually, the world is about me forging my own destiny and making decisions for my life, and the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of life, liberty, right? These things. Then it starts to say, okay, well, let's phrase salvation in this kind of language. Let's talk about salvation in terms of choices that I make as an element of my freedom. And if you really don't believe me, read Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Convention, where actually he also introduces the separation of church and state, which Baptists already believed because of their history and their conflict with established churches. They were all, gung-ho about separation of church and state. But Thomas Jefferson, who literally cut passages out of his Bible that he didn't like because they were miraculous and all these kinds of things, basically says the Baptists are the best because they're like the most suited for America, and they're most suited for this new experiment that they're doing in America. And I would say time vindicated Thomas Jefferson. The Baptist denominations in the United States explode. The southern United States is majority Baptist in a lot of ways, and Methodism was a big thing in the United States. I've talked in some other history videos about how Methodism in a way was kind of America's adaptation of Anglicanism after the Revolution, after it was like unfashionable to associate yourself with England because we literally just rebelled from them. Methodism becomes its own denomination in the United States, largely as apart from Anglicanism, as apart from the Episcopal Church, in large part because of the Revolution. Okay, in all of these things, we're basically saying let's put ourselves in contrast to this, and setting yourself up to answer the questions, to answer the attitudes of the time that you're in. And you have to be able to do that too. If you don't do that, you also die, right? That's the next thing. So if you don't answer the questions of the time you're in, I would say basically like what we're seeing today with non-denominational Christianity and the kind of meaning crisis, decision theology and the meaning crisis, you're also going to lose. You're also going to fall out of step because you didn't answer the questions of the time. But what you have to prioritize instead is kind of the metafacts that answer all of the questions, so that you have the answer to the questions, and don't forget the things that you had in the past. In a lot of ways, I think Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and the trad movements that are related to them are kind of motivated in a part due to just an overcorrection to the world we're seeing now. And I think some people criticize them just for that. But here's my counter to Protestants. That's kind of should be true. There should be an answer in our repertoire to the problems of today. And if we don't have an answer to the problems of today, that's because we're not preaching the metafact, if that makes sense. We're not preaching a gospel that is solution to the world crisis. We're preaching we're preaching some of the things here. And so you kind of have to have this complete theology that has all these answers. And every denomination struggles with having all of the answers, and some denominations are going to thrive in certain contexts because they overemphasize the answers to the questions that people are asking at that time, if that makes sense. That's kind of my point. Okay? But I think the wise thing to do here is to look at these things as kind of institutions. And I think we've maybe this will be also kind of controversial, or possibly hopefully interesting to people who like to think about these things. Okay, what is conservatism? I think conservatism has gotten a bad rap for so many reasons. One, there's this kind of obvious that the generic left wing not being a conservative, obviously they're not going to like conservatives, but also in the right wing movement, I would say today, in the Christian movement, there's this idea of like, what is conservatism conserve? And there's a kind of criticism of kind of moderate conservatism. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because what conservatism can turn into is just progressivism driving the speed limit, I think is a good way of putting it, right? Like let's kind of acclimate to this. And I think conservatives shouldn't be surprised by this. I think if you read Edmund Burke, for instance, he kind of makes this argument, if that makes sense, that's what conservatism is. Edmund Burke started off as someone who supported things like the French Revolution, a liberal, a classical liberal in the sense. But then once the French Revolution starts to unwind and it's chaotic, he basically says, okay, well, we're going to need to change as a society, probably in liberal directions, but if we change too fast, bad stuff happens. Okay? This is one reading, I guess you could say, of Edinburgh. And so because bad stuff will happen if we do it all at once, we have to slow down the pace of progress. Which, you know, what if that progress is bad? Is might be the next question. What if the thing we're progressing towards is hell? What if the thing we're progressing towards is chaos? What if the thing we're progressing towards is nihilism and hedonism? Okay, should we just progress towards that at the speed limit? Is that wise? Just because that'll make our civilization last 20 or 30 years longer before we completely kill ourselves? That's not really, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think it's kind of sad. But on the other hand, what I think happens in a trad reactionary movement to that, so we should say, okay, well, let's not adapt, is you actually have to realize that the thing that's threatening the social order right now, whatever that is, whatever the previous establishment was, the reason that a left movement, a chaotic movement, a progressive movement emerged at all, and this is true about the Protestant Reformation, by the way, is because there was something wrong. There was something maladapted to the situations on the ground about the establishment. And a lot of times that's just a fact of technological advancement or environmental changes that you do have to adapt to. And a reluctance to adapt at all actually isn't the response to speed limit conservatism. Does that make sense? The refusal to adapt at all is actually unwise. I would say that's basically what a lot of the absolutist movement in the history of Western civilization was, which was typified by Catholicism. So the French monarchy was very much like this, I think. Actually, I would say the Habsburgs are very different. The Spanish monarchy was very like this. The Russian monarchy was very like this too, Orthodox country. That they basically said, okay, well, anytime we concede to change, we open ourselves up to a future compromise, and so we really shouldn't. This is an ill-advised situation because we know that, and at the end of the road of these compromises with the liberal movement, if you will, or the left movement, is anarchy, chaos, hell, unchristianity, atheism, and actually that's true. That's the kind of stunning realization that you kind of have to make at a certain point. However, then you have a kind of Bismarckian conservatism, I'll point out, which is Otto von Bismarck was coming into the Prussian monarchy establishment, all that kind of stuff in the 19th century. And what were the big liberal aims, okay, in the 19th century in Germany? I mean, you can look all this stuff up on your own if you like, but this is a quick summary, okay? So Prussia was one of the victors of the Napoleonic Wars, but they suffered a lot, and all of Germans suffered a lot. And the Napoleonic Wars were kind of an ideological struggle to some extent. There was liberalism. Napoleon's constitution even was very liberal compared to most of the monarchies. And so the conservative, older monarchies, establishment Christianity, if you will, kind of banded together to oppose Napoleon. And the reason they did this is because they saw him as a threat to the establishment, okay? However, after Napoleon's gone, the 19th century starts to roll on, and the ideas embodied by the French Revolution remain. And we still have to reconcile with with liberalism, if you will. Egalitarianism, republicanism. And if you look at the early stages of the German liberal movement, that was associated with nationalism. So the nationalist movement in Germany and in lots of these countries was actually very liberal. This is why the Prussian monarchy initially rejects the Frankfurt Revolution, I believe it is, in 1848, to try to create a German national state headed by the Prussian monarchy, because the constitution that they write is extremely Republican, it's extremely liberal, and it would basically neuter the Prussian monarchy and neuter the aristocracy of Prussia, and neuter the historic institutions of Prussia and replace them with liberal ones. I would say basically, if you follow the Italian formation of Italy, it actually is the what if the liberals nationalists win. So like Cavour and some of these French guys basically invent Italy as a geopolitical tool, create Italy. It has a monarchy headed by the Savoyards, who agree to all the liberal reforms, but they end up slowly destroying the conservative aristocracy, the older institutions in Italy, because they can't play ball. So if you look at any literature, any records of the history of 19th century Italy, especially after the formation of the national state of Italy, it's a conflict between the government, anti-clericalism, liberalism, and the old institutions that used to run Italy before the formation of Italy. So the papacy, right? Italy and the papacy don't get along, even though Italy, in theory, is a Catholic country. Um, there used to be entire towns run by basically noble aristocracies, which end up having to be replaced by civil bureaucrats, and Italy goes through a revolution. Anyway, as opposed to that kind of nationalism, that kind of liberalism, that liberal revolution, Bismarck comes into power in Prussia and says, okay, here's what we can adapt from the liberal program, and here's what we can't. And he throws out the stuff that they can't and keeps the stuff that they can. So he creates a civil service that's basically made of Prussian conservatives to solve some of the problems that these older, more chalcified, feudalistic systems can't solve, but make sure that they're aligned with the conservative institutions. He implements lots of reforms that we would today consider kind of semi-socialistic, like pensions and work wages and stuff like that, to basically address those concerns in the Industrial Revolution, in the emerging Industrial Revolution with kind of workplace problems. He begins to support German nationalism, headed by Prussia, but under Prussian terms. So when the Kaiser comes to power, there's this kind of what's called Prussian constitutional monarchy, which isn't the same as the other kinds of constitutional monarchies, because the Kaiser really does have a lot of authority. When World War I takes place, starts to happen, it's really the military that's in charge of the government during World War I in Germany, because the military, the Junker class, has this kind of monopoly on power in Prussia. And with as long as they get the consent of the Kaiser, that's good. They can run Germany, and they do. That's basically what Paul von Hindenburg does. And today we might think, oh, the military takes over the government during wartime, it would be like dystopia. But Paul von Hindenburg remains a hero during a German hero until World War II, basically, and Germany thinks of him as like the near savior of the country. Okay. Anyway, what am I pointing all this out for? What I'm pointing out is that you can, and then of course the World War I ends up destroying the German aristocracy, but up until World War I, they run Germany. And that was, I would think, a successful adaptation of a system. And the same thing is true about Christianity, because Christianity, religions in general, are the substrate of a society. What we believe, what we practice in our religious worlds, it has to bleed over into society. It has to be informative of our culture and our way of life. If you want to hear some of my thoughts more on this, I have a video on Christian nationalism where I talk about this more. But let's say you're a Roman Catholic, you're Eastern Orthodox, you're watching this and you're saying, okay, so what does this have to do with us? This is a perfect argument for our ancient faith, unchanging, nothing, we've got all the answers and all this stuff. Well, okay, look at Europe. Look at the Christian countries in the world. Which are the most religious, and which are the ones that even have monarchies anymore? And for the most part, they're Protestant countries. And it's not because they adapted to the system. I mean, a perfect example I always want to give about this is the Lutheran countries in Scandinavia and the Netherlands all have, and of course Anglicans have the British monarchy. Okay, all of them have maintained their monarchies without exception. So, but most of the Catholic countries, France, Italy, Hungary, Spain. Oh, Spain still has a monarchy actually, but they've had a tumultuous history with their monarchy. Portugal, Austria, Czechia. I mean, Czechia didn't really have its own monarchy for a long time, but that's the Bohemians, whatever. Poland, they don't have monarchies anymore. And the Eastern Europe ones get a little more complicated, but perfect example would also be the Russian monarchy. Something you can't follow the history of the Russian Revolution, up to the Russian Revolution, and say there was nothing that could have been done differently to avoid this on the part of the establishment. Does that mean that you agree with the revolutionaries? No, not at all. But there has to be kind of a give and take there, and there has to be an adaptability. And I think again, looking at the Lutheran states specifically, they were majority Lutheran countries. I think Denmark and Sweden, 90% of the country were Lutheran and regularly attending the state church up until the 1970s. And then stuff starts to kind of go off the rails. But which was basically, I would say, when we started to enter the Christian winter, which is kind of hitting all camps in a lot of ways. But the answer here is this is really about answers. So Lutheranism was adaptable enough. Anglicanism was adaptable enough, and the flexibility enough to be accommodating of genuinely good concerns in the society. I would say rooted in Protestant concerns about assurance of salvation and the hope that's within us, all that kind of stuff from the Protestant Reformation. But also with the goal of maintaining contiguous order in society, not overturning it, which I would say is more defined by like the Zwinglian Reformation, right? When Zwingli gets to power, he starts writing his own mass, changing everything, getting rid of all of the ornaments, getting rid of all of the iconography, getting rid of all of everything from the ground up, start from the Bible, go up, okay? He's making his own system, and in some sense, he's the first, like, leftist. I know people are gonna, conservative Reformed fans in my comments are gonna be, like, going crazy, but like I said, I'm gonna offend absolutely everybody in this video. But he's basically the first leftist. He's basically saying, I can start this system on my own. Here, let's start it. Let's write it out. Let's get a piece of paper. And that's unfound in church history. No Christians had that attitude towards the services of the church, the liturgy of the church, the institutions of the church. Like, no matter how many conflicts we went through, no matter how many heresies started to show up, it was actually pretty rare for that to be the attitude. If you even look at the iconoclasts in the Byzantine period, they kept bishops. They basically just wanted to influence the church the way that it was at that time. They were very radical for their time. Don't get me wrong, and even they didn't have the regulative principle of worship, if you will. And that's a lot harder to do. Why? Because you end up getting rid of all the technology. Because once you go through this change period, once you go through this tension period where society wants an answer to a problem, and you show how the gospel conveys that, you show how the institution has a solution to that, if you will, how the establishment has a solution to that, you keep that in the books, and you get to move forward with it. Okay? The problem, too, though, I will say, with movements that are like this, is what will happen is you keep your answer as the answer. So you'll go through this big period about the struggle, I would say, between grace, assurance of salvation, all that kind of stuff. And then you get into a society like we are in today where people are like, I need a place. I need responsibility. Give me meaning in life. And you say, okay, but you're saved by grace alone, and it's nothing you can do. God made the decision before the beginning of time. And it's like, I don't really see how that answers my problem. Shouldn't the gospel be the good news, and shouldn't the good news answer all my problems, kind of? And they're not wrong to think that it should answer all their problems. That's my next contention. It doesn't mean that your life's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that being a follower of Christ doesn't mean that understanding the truth of Christianity is going to make your life have no problems, but that it'll always have an answer. Because that's what heaven coming to earth means, right? So when we talk about Jordan Peterson, a lot of people will compare his ideology basically to the Tower of Babel. That we do all the things we need to do. He kind of sees God as a projection of the human consciousness. So there's something about God that's like humans. And so in that way, humans are like gods, and then we can kind of take earth and flip it and put it into a place that's like heaven. Through our own power, through cleaning our room, if you will. Is kind of a way that he has phrasing this. But the gospel is actually the reverse. And the Bible is pretty clear about this. So there's this idea, the parallel, I think Glenn Scrivener is very good at articulating this difference between Jordan Peterson and Christianity, but there are gospels where it is about us building to heaven, and then there's the gospel, where it's about heaven coming to earth. And that's not a us game. That's not our human power game. And if you listen to Jonathan Pageau, I think he knows how to talk about this. And he's Orthodox, guys. This is where I'm less critical of those traditions, because I do think that certain doctrines like theosis, as much as you might want to tinker with them as semi-Pelagian, if you word them right, which they don't always do, people don't always word all of these doctrines correctly, but if you word it right, it's really about how God changes you through your self-denial. So it's actually about not about embracing humanity and embracing the human will and embracing humanity, but instead about God living, making the image of Christ manifest in your image, in your humanity. And God's doing that, not you. And that is Christianity. And so what that means is a different way of looking about at the world. And that is true, and that's immortal, and that's unchanging. And there won't be a time where that message is not true. But what that also can mean, what that should entail us preaching, is that God coming in live in you is very visible. That God manifesting himself on earth, heaven manifesting itself in the world, is visible. And it doesn't look like a Walmart parking lot. That's kind of the problem. You know, why is it such a big deal to so many Christians today that like half of us are worshiping in rundown Domino's? You know, or I say half of us. Other Christians, evangelicals, don't care, and they have these mega churches or people up on strings and wires. Like, because is that what heaven looks like? You know, the ecclesiology, the church life of early Christians, and even all Christian denominations during the Protestant Reformation were so focused on making the church service look like heaven. In the Lutheran tradition, it's called the divine service. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it's called the divine liturgy. This is about heaven coming to earth. And worship teaches you that. And heaven coming to earth is the solution to all problems. I mean, that's a category description of heaven coming to earth. The church is the reverse Tower of Babel. You know, that's Jacob's ladder. God coming to earth to deal with sin, to create this ontological reconciliation. And you know, when I sat down today saying I was going to make a video, I thought I was going to make a video on justification and talk about things like ontological versus forensic justification, things like that. But making those distinctions is important because our ontological reconciliation, our reconciliation of being, of individuals, and of the world is the gospel also, not just free grace. You know, I think that simplistic message is going to lose people because it paints a picture of Christianity that is the answer to one question rather than every question, which is what it is. And I think as we're seeing the thawing of the Christian winter, people are emerging, coming back into Christianity. The Christianity that doesn't have answers to these solutions, answers to these problems, will die. And that's for the best. I mean, I think that's providence in a sense. And I think the meaning crisis was supposed to awaken that true doctrine in the church. But on the other hand, the churches that are built just to answer the meaning crisis are also going to die in 30, 40 years. And so we kind of have to strike a middle way, strike a via media, if you will. Via media is like become my buzzword. Every time I hear it or think it, I'm like, there's like a monkey in the back of my mind, like, ooh, via media. But it's true, you know. I think that's Anglicanism. There's a real good case to make for the via media. There's a good case to make for what we might call the conservative Reformation, right? That sometimes things need to adapt. Sometimes things need to demonstrate the answers that were handed down in the apostolic faith in a new context. Okay, before I keep rambling on forever, that's the end of the video. That's my thoughts on. On the Christian winter, as I'm calling it. And I'm probably going to make more videos about the Christian winter because I think it's real. And it's like, what are we going to do about it? if we don't do anything, we'll die. I say, what are we going to do about it? What is God doing in churches, in Christianity right now through this movement? That's what we need to know. That's what we need to understand and describe and address. And people that are addressing it are succeeding, and people that aren't are failing. Even I think the many solutions to these problems are manifesting themselves today. That's orthodoxy, that's Catholicism, that's trad Catholicism, if you will, trad orthodoxy. That's also the Reconquista movement in the Protestant world, is this idea that we will reclaim these institutions. We will be an institutional Christianity again. And that's addressing the problem. And that way, I kind of support the Reconquista more than I support those other solutions, even if I'm not wholesale Reconquistist, if you will, Reconquistador. Okay, before I keep going on forever, thank you for watching. If you want to support me, you can support me over at younganglicans.locals.com. Otherwise, just kind of subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the video if you liked the video. When you subscribe, hit the little bell button. You'll get notified whenever I make a new video. Yeah, thanks for watching, and God bless.